Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. I'm been really focused on what's going on in the United States with race relations, with police brutality, with protests that have turned to riots, and I came across a gentleman that's organized an organization here in Canada called the Zero Gun Violence Movement. His name is Lois March. I'm going to introduce you to him in a minute. And then I wanted to bring in some people that are familiar with a lot of these same issues in Toronto, or the Greater Toronto Area, specifically Peel, and find out, what's going on and what we can be doing about this. So to start with, let me introduce you to our panel tonight. Louis, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Yes, thanks for having me on the show, Brian. I enjoy doing this type of work because there's narratives about gun violence that are seldom told. And here's an opportunity to really keep it real. So I'm the founder of the Zero Gun Violence Movement. It's a collaboration of over 40 different organizations, agencies, programs across the city of Toronto, fighting, advocating for this very ambitious and bold objective of zero gun violence. Most people think I've lost it because they said it's impossible. And my response to them is, I'm not sure why you think it's impossible when we already have it in the city of Toronto, but we only have it in certain parts of the city for certain people. So if you're in Toronto and you live in Rosedale, you don't have to worry about gun violence. But if you live in Rexdale, you better be worrying about it. So why do we have this huge difference, and why has it become the status quo and the norm? So Zero Gun Violence Movement is about how do we close the gap? What is it that's going on in Rosedale that is not going on in Rexdale? And what is it that we need to do to close the gap? Because definitely there's no political will to do it. That's why it still exists. So Zero Gun Violence Movement, we have three main objectives. The first objective
Hold it. Let's come back to that in a minute. I'm going to introduce the rest of the panelists for a second, if I could.
Awesome.
So Frances Bradshaw, she's a political activist. Frances, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Brian, thank you so much for having me. And just as a side note, Louis, I've heard so many amazing things about you, so I'm glad that we've been able to connect in some way. Hopefully you'll like me at the end of this and we'll be able to work alongside each other. So as you said, my name's Frances Bradshaw. I'm actually the senior advisor for Mayor Patrick Brown in Brampton. And I call myself a political activist. And by that, I mean, I believe that politics can be used as an act of activism to bring about change. And so some of the things that Louis just mentioned there, Louis, I can tell you there's a lot of political will on my end. I'm there because these are things that we need to actually create lasting change on. I see a lot of the things that Louis, I think, is going to touch on from a political lens, and I look at it as how can I affect change for my community. As a Black woman, I feel a strong sense of responsibility to represent my community and advocate for them, and also bring them to the decision-making table. I think one of the problems that we look at is that there are not enough of us at the decision-making tables to influence those policy changes that Louis is talking about. So thank you for having us, Brian.
My pleasure. Michael Farquharson, he calls himself an advocate. Tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Well, Brian, first off, I just want to thank you for this opportunity to be here on this year program and just to talk about what's going on in our community. As Brian said, my name is Michael Farquharson. I'm a husband, a father of three, and 2 years ago I ran for City Council office in Brampton East, 9 and 10, wards 9 and 10 to be specific. I was on the sideline with a lot of things happening, doing my daily job routine, going to work, coming home, taking care of my family. And I was challenged by my wife and said, with all this gun violence happening, especially in our Black community, what are you going to do about it? And I consider it, I'm like, I'm here, I'm a member of the community, what am I doing? And that's when I got involved about 3 years ago. And so I represent a number of organizations, but predominantly the Black, of course, Jamaican Heritage, or part of the Jamaican Canadian Association. And, a couple of years ago when Patrick Brown came to Brampton, met up with Francine and Patrick, I'm also a part of the Mayor Black Advisory Committee. And so my advocacy is, as Louis put it, zero gun violence. That's what we need. Why some areas are more prone than others. And I agree with you, Louis. It's possible to have zero gun violence across the GTA, across Canada. And that's why I'm here to speak about those things and advocate for a safe community where no one is feel threatened, or no one, because of the color of their skin, is afraid to go out any time of night just to be in the community. And that's why I'm here, Brian.
Well, Louis, Michael, and Francis, thanks for joining us. We're going to take a quick break, everyone, for some messages, and we're going to come back with this panel and hear more about this zero gun violence activity and then what's going on. Stay with us. Well, welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got a panel tonight with some really interesting people from the Greater Toronto Area to talk about what's happening in the United States, but more importantly, what's happening in Canada and gun violence here in Canada and how we can stop it. And I want to start with Lois March, who is a founder of the Zero Gun Violence Movement, a Toronto-based educational and advocacy organization. Lois, we've had lots of attention to race relations, to violence, to gun violence, to police brutality. Tell me what your organization wants to do.
I think it's important to recognize that the gun violence compared to this time last year was a terrible year when it comes to gun violence, homicides, and shootings. This year, you would not believe this. The amount of homicides due to gun violence has increased over 30% from this time last year. The amount of shootings have increased 20% from this time compared to this time last year. But because the media is not covering it because of COVID and so on, people have this sense that gun violence has gone down until recently when we had the shooting on King Street and John Street. The numbers are staggering. They've been increasing over the last 6 years, and we have not had any interruption, and it's getting worse every year because the fundamental core reasons for gun violence are not being addressed. So people are looking at gun violence as the problem. I say it's not the problem. It's a symptom of a bigger problem. I look at gun violence as a report card. When you go to school, and you get a report card and you've got 8 subjects and it tells you what you did in them. Were you successful in English, in history, in math and science and so on? That's your report card. Gun violence is a public report card that tells us, were we successful dealing with the issue of poverty, education, employment, policing, right? Corrections, family supports, community development. And Brian, we have failed in many of those areas. So gun violence will continue to rise because we're not dealing with the fundamental. So Zero Gun Violence Movement is about bringing awareness to these other aspects. We have a premier that says he's from the old school. That means I'm going to invest more in putting more police on the ground, more boots on the ground, he says. But he is not talking about investing in communities. He's not talking about dealing with the issues. His response is just deal with gun violence. But if you do not deal with the fundamental reasons for it, we don't even talk about root causes anymore, Brian. We talk about the seeds, because before the roots come seeds. We continue to plant the same seeds so that we can deal with the roots. I'm saying stop planting the seeds of gun violence. And it's not only gun violence that we deal with. There's other forms of violence that's taking place in this report card. So we actually work with the victims of gun violence. We actually work with the people responsible for the gun violence. That means people that have pulled the trigger, have done the crime, done the time, and want to make a difference. I'd rather sit down around a table with them than come up with solutions than listen to politicians and the police, because they seldom tell the full story when we are communicating with them or when they're speaking to the public. So that's where Zero Gun Violence comes in. We are an advocacy group. We don't have a president. We don't have a head office. We work on the streets, working with the people that are most impacted by gun violence. So when we speak, we're giving voice to these people that are seldom at the decision making table, as Francine said, right? This is the population we work with. And one of our biggest successes recently in our advocacy piece is getting the Toronto Board of Health to agree that gun violence and community violence are social determinants of a person's health and wellness. So if they recognize that these are the things that are limiting a person's ability to achieve the maximum potential from a health and wellness point of view, then we have more people at the table. So they've actually acknowledged now, passed a motion at City Hall saying that violence, community violence, limits the individual's ability to achieve their maximum potential from a health and well-being perspective. So that's how we do our work. We actually do work. Most of the people working with us are volunteers. All of them are, as a matter of fact. And most of them will have criminal records.
So to put it simplistically, I guess what you're saying, Louis, is Louis, that the focus on gun violence by itself is not right. What we got to do is we got to take a look at the seeds, as you call it, or the fundamental problems in society that have created the society or the need for and desire for gun violence. Francis, do you agree with that?
Oh my gosh, 100%. In my experience, the people at the decision-making table aren't the people that whose lives we're trying to change. And until we change the narrative of who's being part of those conversations, I don't think you're able to effectively create change. And I think one of the most amazing experiences that I have had, really in particular to youth violence, was when I got a chance to go to the McMurtry Youth Detention Center. So they had been running this amazing program. One second. They'd been running an amazing program that focused on talking with youth about what had been the root causes of how they ended up in the situations that they did. And almost every single one of the youth connected the root cause of their experience to economics. And for me, I believe economics is a critical piece that we somehow don't connect to gang and gun violence. But in the end, a lot of these youth said it was about a job. It was about having money, and also having the idea of what they could be in the future. If they don't see themselves as anything other than athletes or musicians, which is a very narrow field that you can really get into. It's very difficult to become an NBA player. It's very difficult to become a musician. Then they don't see potential for their future. And so we need to create examples for them of people who are able to succeed, who have been through the system and are able to then come out of it with opportunity and doing better. And so this youth program that I attended, every single one of the youth said it was an economic connection, but we never really look at gun and gang violence as an economic issue.
Michael, do you agree? Is it an economic issue?
It is, Brian. Actually, I agree 1,000% with Francis and Louis. I can give you my life experience. I was brought up in Jamaica in a poor community, a poor family, and my mom actually, she was a day's worker, as we call it. So she had to work every day, and if she didn't work, there was no pay. She was actually on food stamp at the time. That's what we call it. So it's all about economics. At that time, I had no hope. I had no future. I didn't know what it looked like. And, when we immigrated to Canada, my wife and I, and the first thing when we started having children, and we were looking at the situation around and said, it's dire. I actually lived in Rexdale. So I lived through that community, know what they go through in terms of gun violence. And we're saying, we gotta leave because we can't stay here. We look for opportunities, there are none. And so even as a father of a 17-year-old, and she was looking for a job and she couldn't find any. And I'm like, this is not good. We need to do something about this. So I believe it's economics for once. And we need to, in terms of job for the youth, if they don't have the opportunity to have jobs that they can see themselves beyond this current circumstance, then it seems like their hope is gone. And that's why they turn to violence, because this gives them a relief. This gives them the opportunity to basically say, you know what, with a gun, I can demand money. With a gun, I can demand things. And so they feel that they're empowered by having a gun. And if you don't have that money, don't have employment, that's what they're going to turn to. And so I agree with Lou and I agree with Francis. That's why it is how it is right now, because of pure economics.
Okay, so what are some of the other fundamental problems we have? Economics, having a job, are one. Are there others?
It's the school system. We just actually got a report based out of Peel, which I think probably will accurately reflect almost every other school system that has racialized youth. Black kids are more likely to be streamed into non-academic areas, whether or not they even want to be, whether or not their parents want them to be. Teachers are consistently streaming them into non-academic fields, which narrows their opportunities in the future. So, and this is starting, we thought in the report it said starting at grade 9, and then we heard somebody at the Peel District School Board say, oh no, this actually starts at grade 5. And the school board has been very unwilling to listen to the voices of Black community members. That report actually came out after weeks and weeks of protest by Black families and Black parents about the treatment of their kids. So
what you're saying is that for some reason, teachers perceive Black people as less capable or less smart or more appropriate for a trade type of occupation rather than higher academics?
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. And if you look within Peel, we have, a very strongly racialized population, yet you look at the teachers, and the teachers do not in any way, and the administration, they don't reflect the actual diversity within the community. So it's not surprising that we're seeing that lack of understanding. The education system is very hierarchical, so being able to move up is challenging. So even some of these younger teachers are having a hard time getting in. The school board was resistant towards engaging to have Black teachers. We had to have a Black woman on the Peel District School Board in order for any of these conversations to come forward. And she's been vilified by the board.
Okay, so economics, education, what else are the fundamental problems?
I think, so if I can just jump in, Brian.
Please.
What we're finding is access to guns, the willingness to use them, the brazenness of the shootings, and the age of the people now using them. There's no code. When you speak to gang people, they say, we used to have a code. We didn't just go around shooting left, right, and center because we didn't want any heat on our business or on our community. So there was restrictions, self-imposed, self-regulated. Now we have young people, 15 years old, carrying semi-automatics and willing to shoot them in broad daylight in public areas. So we've seen changes taking place in that area. And a lot of that is fueled by social media, where they get to brag and boast. We have kids that are shooting up neighborhoods, not because they're going for an individual target. They just want to shoot in this neighborhood to send a message, right? So if my community has to cry, your community has to cry also. So we're seeing a lot more innocents being shot in broad daylight. So there's a culture of gun violence that is taking place now that we have not recognized and have not chosen to deal with it yet. We're still trapped on funding of policing. I'm going to talk about the Toronto City budget. Over the last 6 years, the operating budget for the City of Toronto has increased 20%, from 11.5 billion to 13.5 billion. The amount of money in that same period of time that was to be invested in community, which is education, employment, community development, has actually declined. Imagine that. Investment in community, social services and supports has declined, but the amount of money that they have to spend has increased. And one of the biggest beneficiaries of that increase has been the policing budget.
Okay, so we've got a culture of gun violence. We've got education, we've got economics, Are there any other issues, fundamental reasons?
Yes, Brian. The other issue, I think it's up there with those, are they don't have anyone to look up to in terms of the public eye. In terms of minorities, there are few. Taking, for instance, Brampton here, we only have one a black city councillor. And, when you look at that, the black community is saying, or the kids are saying, who do we look to? If only given an opportunity for one, maybe two persons that are in an influential position. So they have no mentor to look up to, or somebody else, okay, I want to be like that person. It's sporadic. It's all over. It may be one here, maybe one there. In terms of police board also, we have the commissioner, which is of South Asian descent. But apart from that, we have one a black deputy chief, and the others are not reflective of the community. So when our youths look in terms of leadership, there are few and far in between. So I think right now they're looking and said, okay, maybe 1 out of 1,000, maybe 1 out of 2,000. How do I compare to that? How do I look up to that? How do I become a part of that? And that's one of the reasons why I got involved in this, Brian, because there were few. In my area here in Brampton East, where I live, I was the only candidate, the black candidate, that actually put my name forward, myself forward to represent the community. And so when you look at that from a historical perspective, there are few black persons who are stepping up to the plate. And the underlying factor behind that is that we are not seen as persons that are qualified enough, even if we have the qualification, whether the academics, the background, to prove that there is what we call a glass ceiling, and that's always there. Until that is shattered, that is broken, and we're given the equal opportunity to take part and become a part of that leadership structure. And that's what's going to continue to happen. So the youth don't have anyone to look up to. If they do, they're few and far in between. So I think that's one of the fundamental issues that is affecting the black community today.
We're having a conversation tonight about gun violence, both in Canada and the United States. We focused on Toronto so far. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with this, I think, really interesting panel of individuals in just a minute. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about gun violence. We've got Lois March, the founder of Zero Gun Violence Movement, a Toronto-based educational advocacy organization. We've got Michael Farquharson, an advocate, former candidate for city council in Brampton. And we've got Francis Bradshaw, a political activist and someone that's involved in actively consulting with politicians today in Peel Region. Michael, I want to come back to you if I could. So you're talking about a glass ceiling for Black people, for African Canadians, effectively. And I was going to ask you, is that racism? Is it because of what Francis was talking about that people aren't getting the right education? You know, when I think about Barack Obama was a two-term president, the chief of police in Minneapolis that spoke so empathetically a couple of days ago is an African American. You know, one of the candidates for the Liberal leadership and provincially was an African Canadian. One of the candidates for the Conservative leadership federally is an African Canadian. So there seems to be some people that are breaking that glass ceiling. But if people like you feel like there's a glass ceiling, what is that? Is that racism? Is that self-imposed fears? What's the root cause of that?
Best Brian, I believe it's institutional racism. And the reason why I said that, because even though we talk about Barack Obama becoming president of the United States, we probably don't have another Black president for another 100 years. We have candidates that have put themselves forward to run for the leadership of other parties here in Canada. But those are the few, the minority, the less than 0.0% that can do that and will do that. However, for them to get to that stage, they're actually treading water, I call it. They're fighting a battle, an uphill battle all the way to get there. And so even though these few numbers may get to those levels, systematically, many and from the Black community, it's the hardest thing to do is trying to break that glass ceiling. I talk about, in companies. I look across, and especially in the industry that I am in, only few Blacks can get to a certain level. And it seems like once they get to the level, they're stuck there. And it doesn't matter what they do, they're stuck there forever. And so until we remove this institutional racism, it does exist in Canada. I know the premier kind of, deviated from that. It is there. I faced that when I first came to Canada. I came with a accounting background, and I applied for a number of jobs. I went to the interviews, and I didn't get the jobs. And one of the interviewer asked, "Is there a reason?" And point blank, the interviewer said, "You didn't get it because two things: you're not from Canada, and you don't have any Canadian experience." So I said, "Okay, what do I need to do to gain Canadian experience?" "Well, you have to be in the country for a certain number of years." And that's the institutional racism that I'm talking about. So many Blacks face that. Oh, I have the education, I have the background, but because I don't fit the stereotype of who should be in that position, I'm not going to get the job. And so I said, Brian, I think it's institutional racism. And
Francis, you've achieved the heights in political consulting and advisory. Are you subjected to institutional racism?
So it's funny, when I got my position, I'm a senior advisor to the mayor, and people would come into the office and they'd see my office and they would ask, why is that little girl in that job? And it wasn't just because maybe I look young, it's because I was also a Black woman. And I look at my own work experience, whether it's been in political or corporate sectors, and I've actually never worked for somebody more senior than me who is Black. And I'm 33, so I'm not even at the height of my career per se. And I've never actually worked for a more senior. And if ask everybody, have you actually reported up who are in, middle management or up, ask them if they have ever reported up to a Black individual. The proof is in the pudding, as they say. If you don't see the people in those spaces, it is not because we don't want to be there. We're highly educated. We have a lot of experience. Michael may not have had Canadian experience, but he had foreign experience. A lot of us who are Canadian have Canadian experience. My sister's in law school in the United States. She's getting married, and she's talking to me about whether or not she should take her husband's last name because it's African, and it will become a barrier to employment. I carry privilege because my maiden last name was Waldinger, because my dad is white and Polish, so it's a Polish last name. This voice does not really connotate for a lot of people in their minds a Black person. So my resume and my over the phone time with them, they very much were shocked when this woman with a big afro would walk in. And even then, I wouldn't even actually do my hair that way. I would make sure that it was tied down so that they didn't perceive me in a certain way. So there's all these barriers we have to kind of work ourselves around in the workplace, and the perception of whether or not we're capable and competent.
Barack Obama, in a major speech a couple of years ago on this topic of racism, said that some of the responsibility was that there are too many families that didn't have fathers. I interviewed a Black hip hop performer just a couple of weeks ago, and she said that that was one of the biggest issues in her upbringing and in her community. Is that a problem, or is that just something that that people perceive?
It's actually a really interesting question. I'm going to share something with you guys. So there was a program in the United States that was created to give single mothers access to special financial resources. This was done back in the 70s or 80s. And what it did was it took all these families who had no economic opportunities. And so what would end up happening is the father would move out of the home so that their family could get access to this social programming. And so it created a culture that dad didn't live at the house, because if dad lived at the house, we couldn't get access to this programming. So it is not, I really, really take offense when anybody says that it's a Black issue. We have lots of strong Black families that are together. I think it's a misnomer to say that the Black father is not involved and engaged. There's a lot of systemic issues. I do a lot of work in parental alienation. The way that our system is set up favors mothers to be the primary caretaker and care provider. Men are looked at as financial providers only. So if you're a man who already is having economic issues, accessing a good job, accessing all those things, and then society tells you the only role that you play in your child's life is a financial provider, what kind of message are we putting out there? But I have a full belief that Black fathers are strong, they are capable, they are competent. We are just not giving them the resources to be able to be as active in their kids' lives.
What about the role of the police and prisons? You know, I had a show on last night where someone that looks just like you, Francis, said, and lived an upper middle class life in Oakville, said that her and her husband get pulled over by the police on a fairly frequent basis. Is that true? And I think the statistics that you were talking about, Louis, earlier, is that there is a far higher percentage of African Canadians in our prison system than are in our population. And so is some of what's happening because of the police and because of our prison system?
You know something? Let me just take a shot at that. I'm working with a 23-year-old right now. I met him about 6 years ago when he was struggling selling drugs on the street. And we did an event where we got them together and we had a discussion about how do we get them off the street and what would they need to come off the street. So 5 years later, he phones me up 6 years later and he says he needs help because he just had an encounter with the police. He got brutalized to the point that he has to get to the hospital. He had head injuries, face injuries, and body injuries. And there were no charges laid. So I said to him, have you been involved in anything? He says no, because he's trying to get a job where he needs a license, and having a criminal record is not going to allow him to get it. So I said, how many times have you been stopped in the last 5 years? He said, over 100 times. I said, you got to be joking. There's no way that's possible. I said, let me make it easier for you. How many times in the last year have you been stopped by the police? He said, 11 times. I'm saying, what, no charges? He says, I go through this on a regular basis. When I go out on the streets, I have to watch my back because of what the police can do and are doing, not only to me, but his friends. So they're being stopped, they've been questioned to a level of degree right now where when they're walking on the streets, there's a level of fear, despair, and anxiety that they have to deal with, and trauma that white kids do not have to. When the white kids are on the street, they're bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, they have a skip in their step, they're excited. But Black youth, when they're walking on the street, they live in fear that they're going to be stopped by the police and they're going to be brutalized and they have no recourse. So there's a total difference in who's going to be stopped, what charges are going to be laid, and when they get into that justice funnel, they're going to end up in jail. And again, it just perpetuates a system where if they were not stopped and questioned and harassed and arrested, they had a chance of making something of their life. But when you go around in life with criminal records, in fear of walking in a store, there's something called being Black while shopping, right? Or shopping while being Black. I also, when I go into a store, I am scrutinized more than anybody else because of the way I carry myself and the color of my skin. This is a daily occurrence for young Black men in our city, in the GTA, right? So there's the aspirations, the expectations to have a good life are diminished.
I would argue there's not a single family that doesn't have a story of profiling. About her own experience, she herself, as a city councillor, has been profiled, has been stopped and pulled over because they thought she fit the description. And then the officers turned around and said, oh, no, it's a woman. We're looking for a man. Her husband went to go get a cake for their daughter's birthday, and there were officers there, and the officers spent time looking at him, and they were kind of spending time talking to themselves, and he finally asked them, "Can I help you? Is there something wrong?" And they said, "How did you get here?" And they started questioning him at the store while he was picking up a cake for his kid, because they said he fit the description of somebody. This is something that doesn't just happen, whether doesn't matter our socioeconomic status. You can ask Rob Davis, the first Black city councilor. He'll tell you that he's been profiled. These are all people who are upstanding citizens who have no interactions with policing, and they experience it. So we call it systemic racism for a reason. It's in the system.
Okay, so how do we stop this? And I watched this African American police chief in Minneapolis make a speech to the family of the murdered individual. He was incredibly empathetic. He took responsibility for what happened. He said that he fired the officers. He obviously was a very capable police chief. And if the police chief is Black and he sounded to me at least like incredibly empathetic and understanding that he put the right criteria, and right away he had fired the 4 officers. If he can't make changes, if Barack Obama in 8 years can't make changes, how are we ever going to have changes?
Brian, yes.
There's a culture going on, right? A policing culture where they know they can do this and get away with it. So one person is not going to change the culture, right? It's a culture, but it's also an individual belief. They talk about it's just a few bad apples. No, it's not. This is a culture of brutality against people based on their race. And one person, whether you're a chief, because we have a chief in Toronto. Has he changed the culture? Hell no. He has not been able to do it. But it's a culture. It's more than an individual that's going to change this.
Michael?
Back on what Louis is saying, it's just a culture and it's a system, systematic racism, we'll call it. And that's why one of the ways I'm advocating to change that, changing the culture and the system, you got to get more Black people out there, get involved in the community, get involved in politics, because you got to elect the police service board, you got to elect the city councilors, school district, you got to elect the city councilors, the MPPs, the MPs. That's where you got to get involved, because we have to change the system. In order for you to change the system, you have to be at the table to push that forward. So it doesn't matter who's at the top. If the system remains the same, we're going to have the same things happening.
And
Louis mentioned about the police chief in Toronto. Yes, Mark cannot change the system. We need people that are in position to change the system, and that's where we need to come in and get more involved in our community, get more involved in politics, because believe it or not, politics is life. Some people say that, oh, I don't want to get involved in politics, but it is part of life. And if you're not changing that, then we're not changing anything. And that's why I'm always advocating, get involved in your community. Black people, get out there, go demonstrate peacefully, non-violently, but also the other part is get at the table where you can effect change from a policy perspective.
Get at the table.
Brian.
It's good to me. Francis, I'm going to take a break for a message, and we're going to come right back in just a minute. Stay with us.
Heads up.
Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. You know, I'm really enjoying this conversation with 3 excellent panelists. Louis from Gun Violence Advocacy Organization, or Against Gun Violence Advocacy Organization. Michael Farquharson, former candidate for city councilor, and a guy who's telling us all to get involved and get at the table. And Francis Bradshaw, who is a political activist and has, told us tonight about institutional racism that I think is a little bit scary, at least for me, because obviously something that I don't encounter. I got to tell you, I did spend a week in Lagos, Nigeria, where I was a speaker at a conference. And the first day I felt a little strange because I was the only non-Black person in the room. But after a couple of days, or frankly, I think it was the second day, I thought I was like everybody else. And I really think everyone should go that experience where they're completely, every white person needs to go through that experience where they're completely immersed in an environment where there's no other white people around, and we find it a lot different. Anyway, what's going on in the United States is shocking. It's unbelievable. It started as a protest against the brutal murder of a black man. But then it became first peaceful protests, then riots and looting. If you were a parent in the United States and your kids wanted to join those protests, what would you say? And how do you as a Canadian feel about what's going on? Maybe I can start with you, Michael.
Well, as a parent, Brian, I would tell my daughter, go demonstrate peacefully, nonviolently, obey the curfew laws, but also, be aware, look over your back, check your shoulders, because in the U.S. right now, it's volatile and anything can change at any minute. What I would encourage the governors and the president to do is not bring in the National Guard to police the demonstrators, but give them safe passage. You see, if demonstrators are demonstrating peacefully, we know there are going to be persons in the crowd that want to start the rioting, the looting, and the burning. So I would say, give them a safe passage, stay on the sides, let them go through. Then you'll be able to catch those who want to instigate violence and looting and burning, because those people don't represent what the George family is going through. And we want to make sure that as a community, we're out there advocating for change, but we need to do it non-violently and peacefully.
Francis, over to you.
So I actually have 3 black stepsons, and my husband is black and he is in Los Angeles, and all of them are in the United States. So for me, the United States is a very different environment from Canada. And unfortunately, they have created the system that is in place right now that forces black people to get to the stage of rioting before they're heard. If we look, the Civil Rights Act of, I think it was 1968, came out of riots. And so we have taught black people that the only way that you will be heard is if you violently protest. And so that activity will continue until the system is willing to listen to them. When we took a knee, the President of the United States called us sons of bees, which I guess I can't say on your radio show, but you guys know what that is. So don't be surprised when things pop off like this. We need to look, but one thing I want to encourage is turn your protest and your riot into policy and political activity. There needs to be that transition where you take this opportunity in time. This is our civil rights movement of my generation right now. And we need to take this time and space to transition our anger and our fear and our frustration into political and policy activism.
Louis, final word to you.
Yeah, I think it's important to, if I had children in the States, I would say you need to get involved. You need to get engaged. And there's several ways in which you can do it. Demonstrating and protesting is one way. In getting involved in politics, educating yourself, right? What we saw with George has happened on a daily basis in the United States of America for years. And the only reason everybody's getting excited is because of the brutality and the fact that it was on film. But imagine the many cases that has happened that were not captured on film, right? We had a jogger 2 months before charges were laid, even though the policing system had footage of him being shot brutally, right? So my message is get involved. There's different ways in which to do it. Protest and demonstration is one way. Getting involved in politics is one way, but educate yourself to understand what's going on and find other ways to influence government. Because if Americans' government is the best that we have right now in that country, we got a problem. So my final word would be about get involved. Don't be silent. And my other advice would be the silent participants, which are the non-Black people, right? The ones that are not experiencing it, they need to get up and realize their privileged position and their silence is contributing to the systemic racist system that exists. And until they get up and say, we've also had enough, we've seen it and we need to do something about it, those silent participants need to participate in finding legitimate solutions.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for participating tonight. We're going to take one final break for a message and come back for some concluding comments. Thank you all very much. This has been an excellent panel discussion. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. You know, I have found this conversation today really quite stark and interesting. You know, I think we talked about some of the fundamental reasons for gun violence, and we indicated that they were economic, that they were jobs, that they were education, that they were glass ceilings that Black people, Black African Canadians hit. And we talked about systemic racism. And Louis talked about a culture of violence, culture of gun violence. And all of those are fundamental problems that we need to address. But maybe I can speak finally to the listeners out there that are white like myself. And Louis sort of mentioned this. I don't think that the three panelists here are going to stop racism. I think it's going to be people that look like me that stop racism. It's going to be up to white Americans and white Canadians to stop racism. It's not going to be up to our African Canadian, African American friends to stop racism. We've got to make friends across the racial divide. We've got to get to know people. We've got to understand their problems. And we have got to stop systemic racism. And we've got to create jobs. We've got to get rid of the glass ceiling. We got to create a fair educational system. And we got to ensure that we don't have gun violence. Thank you for joining us tonight. Every night, 6 o'clock, 9:60 a.m. Please join us. Good night.